Please pray with me before I offer a message this morning. Gracious and loving God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. A few months ago, I had the privilege of attending a wonderful musical performance at Cal State Fullerton, and I saw a number of our singers there. They are students in the Cal State music program, and they are part of a tremendous choir, a student choir there. They sang Mendelssohn's Elijah, and it was one of the most beautiful performances I have ever heard. So I came back to the church and I said to our minister of music, John, is there any way that we could use these songs in worship, and perhaps I could preach about the scriptures from Elijah, these stories of the prophet in the Old Testament? So that's what we're going to do. Today and the next 2 weeks, we'll explore the meaning of Elijah, his story, and also hear these wonderful songs that these folks know pretty well because they were forced to sing them many, many times, and they sing them beautifully. So this Sunday after the service, there's one response, and then our anthems in the next coming weeks will also be from that beautiful work, Mendelssohn's Elijah. So today we begin with a story of Elijah and the widow, and it's a famous story about Elijah challenging her to trust God above all else. She is famished, she's starving, and so is her son. And yet Elijah comes and asks for a drink of water, and while she's going to get that drink of water, he adds another request and says, could I have some food too? This arrests her in her tracks. She stops and says, this is something I can't do. This last morsel of meal that I had was going to be baked for me and my son. I was going to feed it to him and to myself, and then we were going to starve. Nevertheless, Elijah asks for this impossible request, and she's caught between the need to show hospitality, that ancient principle, that teaching that people were called to follow, that ethic and law of hospitality. She's trapped between that principle and her own survival and the survival of her son. But she goes and she brings him that food. She trusts God against all of her instincts, against all of her intuitions. Trust is a very difficult thing for us as human beings to practice. And this is an extreme example of trusting God's promise, an extreme example of faith. So often faith itself seems counterintuitive to us, and we're forced to trust where our instincts tell us not to do so. It's like the man who was traveling to the Grand Canyon, and he was walking along the edge of the canyon. He was far away from the crowds. He was exploring by himself, and tragically he slipped into the Grand Canyon. But before he could fall very far, he held on to a strong rock and found his grip there. And as he was hanging, he began to cry out, and he said, help me, somebody help me. And finally, a voice said, I can help you. And he said, oh, wonderful, who are you? And the voice said, this is the Lord. And he said, can you help me? And the Lord's voice said, yes, I can save you. And the man said, what do you want me to do? And the voice said, let go. And the man paused and said, anybody else up there? Sometimes trust feels about like that. It's the most terrifying thing that we can imagine, and often that's how it feels. This is how it must have felt to this widow. She was forced to trust God in the most impossible situation, in a situation that may even mean giving up the life of her son to starvation. We see this same trust practiced by Elijah. You see it on the bulletin cover. In the story preceding this one, he's asked by God to go out into the desert to go be fed by the ravens. He's fleeing for his life because Elijah has prayed for a famine to come upon the land to punish a terrible king whose name was Ahab. And Ahab has confronted Elijah, and Elijah says that the Lord will bring a famine and drought upon Ahab's kingdom. And that this indeed happens. So in fear for his life, Elijah runs away and goes into the desert, and we see this raven bringing a morsel of food to him. This is a painting by Loretta Hoffman. It's a modern painting done in the ancient Byzantine style of an icon. These icons are meant to draw us closer to God. We are meant to pray over their appearance and think about what these images teach us about our relationship, our trust of God. And here Elijah is so dependent upon God, he has to let a raven feed him in the desert. And then after that, he's commanded to go to visit this widow and trust her. It would be going to the poorest of the poor and looking for food and provision there. It's an extreme lesson in trust and in faith. Our scriptures today also in the New Testament teach us about this. The widow of the New Testament who Jesus watches bringing her offering to the treasury gives her last coin. It's called the widow's mite. And Jesus says this woman has given more than anyone else combined because she gave all that she has. God knows, as God sees her giving this gift, that she is giving 100% of what she has, whereas these wealthy who give much larger gifts are giving a small percentage of what they own. We begin to learn what it means to trust and what it means to overcome crisis situations. Because both of these widows, these women, teach us how to continue to give of ourselves, even in the most dire of circumstances. What a powerful reminder this is. What a lesson it is that we still have something to give. We have some talent, some purpose, some meaning in our lives, some gift that we are called to give in this lifetime. And in the giving of that gift, we begin to forget how scarce the resources are around us, how desperate our circumstances really are. Through the act of giving, in the name of God's love, we come out of that rut. We come out of that stuck place, and we begin to feel freed in the generous love of God flowing through us. We are liberated from our bondage by giving. What a wonderful message Elijah brings us today, and how urgently needed this is. As we read in the news and as we see what's going on in the world around us, we become so anxious. We become desperate for understanding. In the last few weeks, we've witnessed terrible natural disasters. We have seen the Carolinas pounded by hurricanes. We have read about Indonesia being overwhelmed by a tsunami, many hundreds of people being killed. In a similar way, the storms rage in our own land, and the political tensions in our government rise to a fever pitch. We are all troubled, and even if there is some resolution that is achieved in that process, our nation remains divided with conflicted feelings and tensions towards one another. We have yet to find that peace. How urgent is this message that we still must give? We still must offer whatever we have in the name of God's love and God's peace. Our scriptures show us the way out of that desperate, scarce situation. If we will continue to do our part, if our church will continue to come to disaster relief aid through United Methodist Committee on Relief, if we will continue to feed the hungry around our community and house the homeless as our church does so faithfully, as we continue to do these things, we know that we have done our part. And some of these greater problems we will pray God will take care of in time. The widow teaches us how to give what we have in our hands so that others may know provision and God's peace. I was inspired this past week to see the work of Reverend John Fanistill, who was another senior pastor of this congregation. We have an image of him from the United Methodist News online. This was published because he, as you may know, is a fluent Spanish speaker. He spends a lot of time at the border, and he stays with the poorest of the poor, much like Elijah stays with the poorest of the poor in our story today. In his ministry, he goes to impossible situations where people are about to be deported, where people are suffering acute distress, and he tries to find legal options for them. He is in the background. You recognize him, of course. He preached here many Sundays in the past. Also, Reverend Joel Ortiales is a Methodist minister on the right, and he leads a prayer with Reverend David Farley with this family. The reason why this particular family's situation is so dire is that the father, Jose Antonio, knows that if he returns to Mexico, he may be killed. He is, as the article explains, being accused by certain members of the drug cartel in Mexico of killing one of their members. This case of mistaken identity, he knows, will probably cost his life if he's sent back, so he has desperately cast his burdens upon the Methodist Church and upon God, and they pray here for this solution. There's another image of this beautiful family and the child that's in question too, those that are trying to seek refuge. Thankfully, they have attained some temporary sanctuary in Washington State for this family as they try to work out these legal problems. It's an example of Pastor John giving anything that he has, even when he, like that widow in Zarephath, or like Elijah, cannot yet see the solution. Still, he gives whatever he has to give, to offer comfort, to offer friendship, to stay with that person in her time of need. It is such acts of generosity and love that pull us out of the pit of despair. Amen? It is such self-giving that changes the hearts of people and give us hope once again. And so on this World Communion Sunday, we stand side by side with people throughout the world, remembering how Jesus did this same thing. Even in his acute time of suffering when he knew he would be arrested and probably executed unjustly, nevertheless, he gave of himself. This is my body given for you. Take, eat, in remembrance of me. He showed the disciples how to remain generous of spirit, even in a time of crisis and uncertainty. This is my blood of the new covenant, poured out for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. Today, as we celebrate this meal, as we receive the bread and the cup, let us celebrate this spirit of God's abundant and generous love. And then let us recommit to giving of ourselves, so that others who are afraid and uncertain may clearly see in us the eternal and unquenchable love of the risen Christ in our midst. May it be so. Amen.